At exactly 5:42 a.m., after a 12-hour night shift, Heather Mitchell stood shivering beneath the flickering lights of a Cleveland bus stop, clutching the only winter coat she owned. Just a few feet away, an elderly man sat frozen on the bench, his hands trembling so violently he could barely breathe. Heather hesitated for only a heartbeat before slipping her worn navy coat over his shoulders. As she stepped back into the snow, wearing nothing but her thin scrub jacket, a single coat button broke loose and rolled across the icy pavement. The old man quietly picked it up and slipped it into his pocket. 3 weeks later, that same button lay in the center of a boardroom table inside the city's largest hospital. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your country and your local time in the comments. And if heartfelt stories about kindness, courage, and second chances mean something to you, consider joining our community by subscribing. There's always another story waiting just around the corner. By the time Heather Mitchell reached the third-floor apartment she rented on the east side of Cleveland, the first pale streaks of morning had begun to wash the sky in muted gray. Her fingers were numb from the cold, and every breath felt sharper than the last, without the old navy coat that had shielded her through 6 Ohio winters. Snow clung to her scrubs, melting into tiny droplets that soaked the fabric long before she managed to unlock the apartment door. She paused for a moment before stepping inside. Home was quiet. Not silent, because old apartment buildings were never truly silent. Pipes rattled somewhere inside the walls. A neighbor's television murmured through thin drywall. The heater clicked, struggled, and surrendered once again, filling the living room with more noise than warmth. Heather quietly closed the door behind her. On the couch, curled beneath 2 mismatched blankets, Lily Mitchell was asleep with a box of crayons scattered around her. A notebook rested open on her lap. Half-finished drawings covered the page, city buses, smiling people, wearing colorful scarves, and children hanging winter coats on wooden hooks. Heather smiled, despite the ache spreading through her body. Every morning after school, Lily liked drawing places where everyone felt welcome. She called them warm places. Heather carefully lifted the notebook before it could slide onto the floor. Across the top of the page, written in careful second-grade handwriting, were 6 simple words. Warm things are meant to be shared. Heather brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's forehead. You remembered, she whispered. Months earlier, Lily had asked why her mother always packed an extra peanut butter sandwich whenever she worked weekends. Heather had answered without thinking. Because sometimes the person sitting next to you is hungrier than you are. Lily had nodded thoughtfully before replying with words Heather would never forget. Warm things are meant to be shared. Since then, it had become their little family motto. Not because they had plenty to give, because they almost never did. Heather quietly slipped into the tiny kitchen. The refrigerator held half a gallon of milk eggs, a container of homemade vegetable soup, and leftovers from Sunday night's pasta. A magnet held several bills against the freezer door. Rent. Electricity. Emma No Lily's asthma medication refill. Car insurance. She mentally rearranged the numbers again, just as she did almost every morning. If she delayed the electric bill by 4 days, if overtime became available next week, if the old Honda survived another month, maybe everything would fit. Maybe. She opened one cabinet and found only enough coffee grounds for a single cup. She smiled to herself. That at least was enough. Outside, the aging silver Honda Civic sat beneath a thin layer of snow in the parking lot. It had over 200,000 miles on it. The driver's side window sometimes refused to close completely. The heater only worked when it felt like cooperating. And the check engine light had become such a permanent passenger that Heather joked it deserved its own seatbelt. Still, she treated the little car like family. Every Saturday morning, she and Lily washed it together at a self-service station, even during winter. You take care of things, Heather always said, and sometimes they take care of you. Those lessons were never dramatic. They lived inside ordinary moments. Washing dishes together, mending socks, turning leftovers into tomorrow's lunch, sewing loose buttons back onto old clothes, especially that navy coat. It had belonged to Heather's mother. Years ago, before cancer took her, she had handed it over with a laugh. "I know it's ugly." Heather had laughed too. "It is. But ugly coats keep people just as warm." Every winter afterward, Heather repaired another tear, another loose seam, another worn pocket. She had promised herself she would replace it one day. That day simply never came. Not because she didn't want to, because every extra dollar found somewhere more important to go. New shoes for Lily, a school field trip, an inhaler, a birthday cake. The coat always waited. Heather poured hot coffee into her oldest chipped mug before walking toward the bedroom. She never allowed herself to collapse immediately after work. Instead, she checked Lily's inhaler, refilled the humidifier, prepared breakfast, laid out clean clothes for school, packed tomorrow's lunch. Only then did she finally sit down. Exhaustion settled over her like another blanket. Her body begged for sleep, but her mind kept moving. She remembered Mrs. Alvarez at the nursing home. The elderly woman had refused dinner until Heather sat beside her for 5 minutes. Not because she needed medical attention, because she wanted someone to hear the story about meeting her husband at a dance in 1963. Heather had listened. Again, for what must have been the 20th time. Some coworkers teased her for spending too long with residents. "You'll never finish charting if you keep talking." Heather usually smiled. People measured her work differently. Some counted completed paperwork. Others counted medications delivered on time. Heather counted smiles. Hands that stopped shaking. Lonely people who felt remembered. No performance review ever asked about those things. Yet she believed they mattered most. Around 8 o'clock, soft footsteps crossed the apartment. Lily rubbed her sleepy eyes. "Mom!" Heather turned immediately. "Good morning, sweetheart." Lily noticed something almost instantly. Her eyes searched the coat rack beside the door. Then she looked back at Heather. "Where's your blue coat?" Heather hesitated only briefly. "I met someone who needed it more." Lily blinked. "You gave it away." Heather nodded. It was very cold. For a long moment, the little girl said nothing. Then she walked over and wrapped both arms around her mother's waist. "You'll get cold." "I already was." "But he'll be warm." Heather smiled. "I hope so." Lily leaned back, studying her mother with surprising seriousness for an 8-year-old. "You always tell me kindness comes back." Heather laughed softly. "Not always." "No. No." "Then why do it?" Heather gently held her daughter's hands. "Because someone else's tomorrow might depend on what we choose today?" Lily thought about that carefully. Then she grinned. "That's even better." Heather laughed for the first time in days. Outside the apartment window, snow continued falling across Cleveland. Neither Heather nor Lily could possibly know that somewhere else in the city, an elderly man was holding a single navy coat button in the palm of his hand, unable to forget the woman who had walked away shivering without ever asking his name. Across the city where glass towers reflected the pale winter sun and chauffeurs lined up outside polished entrances, Benjamin Whitmore stood alone in a modest brick garage behind a warehouse he had quietly purchased years earlier. The garage looked nothing like the headquarters of one of Ohio's largest healthcare systems. There were no marble floors, no framed awards, no assistants waiting with schedules. Only an old wooden workbench shelves filled with neatly labeled boxes and a faded green pickup truck with more than 180,000 miles on the odometer. Benjamin preferred it that way. At 79, he had learned that expensive offices often muffled the truth. People spoke differently when they recognized the man signing their paychecks. They smiled longer, they complained less. Problems disappeared the moment he entered a room, only to return after he left. That was why once every few weeks he became someone else. He exchanged tailored suits for worn denim expensive shoes, for weathered work boots, and his silver watch for one that had stopped ticking years earlier. No security team, no driver, no introductions. Just another elderly man trying to get through the day. He buttoned an old brown coat, glanced into the cracked mirror hanging above the workbench, and smiled faintly. "I think you still look convincing," he muttered to himself. The disguise had never been about hiding from danger. It was about finding honesty. Benjamin Whitmore had founded Whitmore Medical Center nearly 40 years earlier, with a promise he had made beside a hospital bed. Back then, he had owned nothing more than a construction company that was beginning to succeed. Every extra dollar had gone toward one impossible dream: building a hospital where patients would never feel invisible. For years, that dream had flourished. The hospital expanded. Clinics opened across northern Ohio. Research programs attracted brilliant physicians. National magazines praised Whitmore Medical Center for innovation and efficiency. Investors applauded. Board members celebrated. Financial reports grew stronger every quarter. Yet somewhere along the journey, Benjamin had begun noticing something those reports could never measure. Patients rarely complained about medicine. They complained about feeling unseen. Families remembered waiting hours without updates. Housekeepers hurried past frightened visitors because they had impossible workloads. Nurses cried in empty supply closets after double shifts. Young employees burned out before their 5th anniversary. The hospital had become remarkably efficient. But efficiency alone could never comfort someone sitting beside a dying parent. Benjamin had slowly stepped away from daily leadership 5 years earlier, handing executive authority to his daughter, Victoria Whitmore. She had earned the position. Nobody questioned her intelligence. She held degrees from Stanford and Wharton. She understood finance, operations, technology, and expansion better than almost anyone Benjamin had ever met. Unfortunately, she also believed nearly every problem could be solved with another spreadsheet. To Victoria, numbers never lied. To Benjamin, numbers simply told incomplete stories. Their disagreements had grown more frequent. "You built this organization with your heart," Victoria had once told him during a board meeting. "And you keep trying to manage it with yours." Benjamin had smiled gently. "I hope I never stop." She sighed. "Hospitals aren't charities." "No. They're businesses." "They're communities," Benjamin corrected quietly. Neither had changed the other's mind. That conversation echoed in his thoughts as he drove the old pickup toward downtown Cleveland. Instead of parking in the executive garage, he left the truck several blocks away. He enjoyed walking. The sidewalks taught him more than conference rooms ever could. Outside a neighborhood bakery, 2 nurses in navy scrubs shared a cinnamon roll because one admitted she'd forgotten her wallet. Across the street, an elderly veteran struggled to open the heavy door of a pharmacy until a teenage cashier rushed outside to help. Near a coffee cart, a sanitation worker laughed with a little boy whose mitten had fallen into a puddle. These moments mattered, not because they were extraordinary, because they revealed who people became when nobody expected applause. Benjamin stopped at a small diner where he often ate during these quiet excursions. The waitress greeted him with the same cheerful smile she offered every customer. "Morning, sir, the usual." He nodded. "Oatmeal and black coffee." She refilled his mug twice before noticing his worn gloves. "Looks colder every year." Benjamin chuckled. "Maybe I'm just getting older. Aren't we all?" She laughed and hurried away to another table. She had no idea the quiet man eating oatmeal owned the hospital where her sister worked as a respiratory therapist. Benjamin preferred it that way. After breakfast, he unfolded a small notebook from his coat pocket. Its pages contained no financial forecasts. Instead, they were filled with handwritten observations. Receptionist stayed after shift to comfort worried father. Volunteer read aloud to patient with failing eyesight. Maintenance worker shoveled sidewalk before sunrise. Some entries celebrated kindness. Others recorded painful failures. Patient waited 47 minutes for wheelchair assistance. Family couldn't find anyone to explain discharge instructions. Employee crying alone in parking garage. He never included names, only moments. He believed organizations changed one moment at a time. His phone vibrated. The screen displayed Victoria's name. He answered. "Good morning." "Dad, where are you?" "Out." She exhaled. "We have a strategic planning meeting in an hour." "You'll manage perfectly well." "This isn't funny." "I wasn't trying to be." A brief silence followed. Then Victoria softened. "You don't have to keep proving something." Benjamin looked through the diner window at people hurrying through the snow. "I'm not proving anything." "Then what are you looking for?" he answered without hesitation. "The reason we started." Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Victoria said quietly, "I'll see you this afternoon." "You will." After the call ended, Benjamin slipped the phone back into his pocket. As he reached for the notebook again, something small rolled against his fingertips inside his coat. The navy button. He held it carefully in his palm. It still carried a few loose blue threads where it had torn away from the fabric. Such an ordinary object, worth perhaps a few cents, yet somehow it felt heavier than polished trophies lining the hospital lobby. He remembered the young woman standing in the snow, wrapping her only coat around a stranger without asking who he was. She had walked away shivering. She hadn't asked for gratitude. She hadn't expected recognition. She simply believed another human being deserved to make it through the morning. Benjamin closed his fingers around the button. For the first time in years, he realized the answers he had been searching for, inside reports and board meetings, might instead be found in people like her. And he intended to find her not to reward her with charity, but to understand the quiet strength that no performance metric could ever capture. The weather forecast had warned of dangerous wind chills, but forecasts rarely changed the routines of people who lived paycheck to paycheck. By 5:10 a.m., the temperature had fallen to 9 degrees. The wind made it feel far colder. Heather Mitchell stepped through the employee entrance of Whitmore Medical Center after finishing another exhausting 12-hour shift. She paused just long enough to stretch the stiffness from her shoulders before pulling her backpack higher against her back. Inside the hospital, everything had been bright and controlled. Outside, winter ruled without mercy. The parking lot lights reflected across fresh snow, turning the ground into a sheet of silver. Her breath drifted into the darkness as she walked toward the bus stop 2 blocks away. She usually drove her old Honda. Not today. The mechanic had called the previous afternoon. The alternator had finally given up. Repair estimate $648. Heather had thanked him politely, hung up the phone, and decided the bus would have to do until she figured something out. She checked the transit app on her phone. Route 26. Delayed. 23 minutes. She sighed. Of course. Her feet already ached from walking nearly 11 miles during her shift. 23 more minutes in the freezing wind felt much longer than the number suggested. When she reached the bus shelter, only one person was there. An elderly man sat motionless on the metal bench. His clothes were clean but old. His brown coat looked far too thin for the weather. Snow had gathered across his shoulders without him brushing it away. Heather noticed his hands first. They weren't simply cold. They were trembling uncontrollably. Years of working as a CNA had taught her to recognize the difference. He wasn't uncomfortable. He was approaching a dangerous point. She glanced around. The morning rush had begun. Cars hurried through the intersection. People walked past carrying coffee cups, collars pulled high against the wind. Most looked briefly toward the old man. None stopped. Heather understood why. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone assumed someone else would help. She looked back at her phone. 21 more minutes. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. She wasn't wearing many layers, just her navy winter coat over faded blue scrubs. Without it, the wait home would be miserable, maybe even risky. A memory interrupted her thoughts. 8-year-old Lily standing in their kitchen only yesterday. "Mom, if someone doesn't have a coat, do they feel colder than us?" Heather had smiled. "I imagine they do." Lily had nodded very seriously. "Warm things are meant to be shared." Heather closed her eyes for a brief second. Then she walked toward the bench. "Sir." The old man slowly raised his head. His face was pale. His lips carried a faint, bluish tint. I'm all right." It was the answer almost everyone gave before admitting they weren't. Heather crouched beside him. "No, you're not." He attempted a smile. "The bus shouldn't be much longer." She looked at his hands again. He wasn't wearing gloves. His fingers had become so stiff he struggled to keep them together. "Have you been sitting here long?" "I'm not sure." His voice shook almost as much as his body. "Long enough." Heather glanced once more toward the empty street. No bus, no police officer, no security guard, only the relentless wind. She slowly unzipped her coat. Immediately the cold slipped through the opening. The elderly man noticed. "No." He shook his head weakly. "You need that." Heather hesitated, not because she questioned what was right, because she was calculating consequences. Without the coat, she would be freezing for the ride home. She might get sick. If she missed work, there would be less money. Rent was already late. Lily needed another inhaler before the end of the month. For one fragile moment, responsibility battled compassion. Neither was selfish. Both mattered. The wind blew harder. The old man's shoulders shook again. Heather made her decision. She slipped the coat from her own shoulders and gently wrapped it around his. The heavy navy fabric settled across him like a blanket. He looked at her in complete disbelief. "You can't." "I can, but you'll freeze." She smiled. "I'll complain about it later." He stared at her for several long seconds. There was something almost painful in his expression. Not pride, not embarrassment, recognition. As though he had spent years searching for something he had almost stopped believing existed. Finally, he asked quietly, "Why would you do this?" Heather tucked the collar closer around his neck. Her hands moved with the same gentle confidence she used while caring for frightened patients. "Because being cold shouldn't decide who gets tomorrow." The words hung in the icy air. Neither of them spoke. As Heather stepped backward, she heard a tiny sound. Click, yuck. One of the old plastic buttons had snapped loose from the worn coat. It bounced once against the concrete, rolled across the sidewalk, and stopped beside the old man's boot. Heather glanced toward it. For an instant, she considered picking it up. Then the headlights of the approaching bus appeared around the corner. She smiled apologetically. "I guess that coat has officially seen better days." The old man bent down slowly, his stiff fingers struggling before finally lifting the navy button from the frozen pavement. He held it carefully in his palm. "It's still a good coat." Heather laughed softly. "It really is." The bus pulled alongside the shelter with a hiss of air brakes. The doors folded open. Samuel Harris, the familiar morning driver, leaned toward the windshield. "Heather?" His smile disappeared immediately. "Where's your coat?" She simply shrugged. "I loaned it to someone." Samuel looked past her toward the elderly man now wrapped in navy fabric. Without another question, he nodded. "Get on. I'll turn the heat up." Heather thanked him and climbed aboard. She chose a seat near the middle, rubbing warmth back into her reddened hands. Through the fogging window, she watched the old man remain on the bench. He wasn't looking at the bus. He was looking at the button resting quietly in his weathered palm. As the bus pulled away, he slowly closed his fingers around it, as though protecting something far more valuable than a broken piece of plastic. Heather never asked his name. She never expected to see him again. She believed the moment had already ended. She couldn't possibly know that the elderly stranger she had just helped would spend the rest of that morning thinking not about the coat itself, but about the woman who had walked away shivering without asking for anything in return. By the time Heather Mitchell reached her apartment that morning, the adrenaline that had carried her through the freezing bus ride had disappeared. The warmth inside the building should have felt comforting, but instead, it made every muscle in her body ache. Her fingers tingled painfully as circulation returned, and a deep chill settled somewhere behind her ribs. She quietly slipped off her shoes and tried not to cough. The attempt lasted only a few seconds. A harsh cough echoed through the apartment. Almost immediately, a bedroom door creaked open. Lily stood in the hallway wearing oversized pajamas, her hair still messy from sleep. "Mom," Heather forced a smile. "I didn't mean to wake you." Lily walked closer, studying her mother's face the way only children who know their parents too well can. "You're sick." "I'm just cold." "No?" Lily gently touched Heather's forehead. "You're warm." Heather laughed softly. "That's usually how fevers work." Lily didn't laugh back. "What happened?" Heather hesitated. She had never wanted her daughter to think kindness came with regret. So instead of mentioning the freezing bus stop or the old man wrapped in her coat, she simply answered with the truth that mattered most. "Someone needed help. And you helped." "I tried." Lily wrapped both arms around her mother's waist. "I'm glad." Heather closed her eyes. There were moments when she wondered if she was teaching her daughter generosity or simply passing down hardship. Sometimes the line between the two felt painfully thin. After Lily left for school, Heather swallowed 2 tablets of generic cold medicine and crawled into bed. She had less than 6 hours before another night shift. Normally she slept almost immediately. Today sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she remembered the old man's trembling hands. She wondered whether he had made it home safely, whether he had anyone waiting for him, whether he had eaten breakfast. Eventually, exhaustion won. When the alarm sounded that afternoon, she felt worse instead of better. Her throat burned, her head pounded. Even standing required effort. She stared at herself in the bathroom mirror. "You can't miss tonight." The word sounded more like a reminder than encouragement. Calling off work would mean losing overtime. Losing overtime meant delaying another bill. Delaying another bill meant another late fee. She simply couldn't afford to become sick. An hour later, she was back inside Whitmore Medical Center. The bright lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and disinfectant. Patients arrived carrying flowers. Visitors hurried toward elevators. Doctors discussed charts while walking briskly through hallways. Life continued at its usual relentless pace. Heather tucked away another cough before clocking in. "Rough day?" asked Maria, another CNA working the evening shift. Heather smiled. "I've had better." Maria looked concerned. "You don't sound good." "I'll survive." "You should have stayed home." Heather almost laughed. Neither of them earned enough to stay home comfortably. Instead, she answered, "Mrs. Donnelly likes her tea exactly at 7. Mr. Harris pretends he doesn't need help buttoning his sweater. And Mrs. Alvarez will ask me to hear the same story again." Maria smiled knowingly. "So, everybody needs Heather." "They need consistency." For the next several hours, Heather moved from room to room despite the growing ache in her body. She helped one resident brush her hair before family arrived. She found another patient's missing hearing aid beneath a blanket. She patiently listened as Mrs. Alvarez once again described dancing with her late husband beneath strings of lights during the summer of 1968. Heather never interrupted. She reacted as though hearing the story for the very first time. "Was he a good dancer?" she asked. Mrs. Alvarez laughed. "Oh, absolutely not." Both women smiled. Outside the room, Daniel Brooks glanced briefly through the open doorway while carrying a clipboard. He checked Heather's attendance record. Perfect. He checked completed documentation. Acceptable. Without saying a word, he continued walking. He never saw the smile Mrs. Alvarez wore after Heather left. He wasn't looking for smiles. Across another part of the city, Benjamin Whitmore sat inside a quiet office that no longer displayed his name on the door. His assistant had delivered a thin folder earlier that afternoon. Inside was only one page. Employee, name Heather Mitchell. Position certified nursing assistant. Employment status part-time. Years of service 6. Disciplinary actions none. Performance evaluations consistently satisfactory. Benjamin frowned. Satisfactory. The word bothered him. Nothing about the woman he'd met at the bus stop felt merely satisfactory. He pressed the intercom. Claire, his longtime assistant, entered. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." "Who prepared this evaluation?" "It comes from standard departmental reviews." Benjamin tapped the paper gently. "Does anyone here evaluate compassion?" Claire looked uncertain. "I'm not sure how that would be measured." Benjamin leaned back quietly. "Exactly." He dismissed her with a polite thank you before opening another drawer. Inside rested the small navy button. He picked it up carefully. Its edges were scratched. One thread still clung stubbornly through one of the holes. Such an insignificant object. Yet somehow it kept reminding him that every chart, every productivity report, every quarterly presentation failed to describe the most important qualities inside a hospital. That evening he made a decision. He would not summon Heather to his office. He would not send her flowers. He would not anonymously pay her bills. Those gestures might ease immediate burdens, but they would also prevent him from discovering who she truly was. Instead, he instructed Claire to arrange something unusual. "I want unrestricted access to patient satisfaction comments from every department. For this quarter, for the past 3 years. And personnel files?" "No." She looked surprised. "No. I don't want to know what managers think first." "What do you want?" Benjamin smiled faintly. "I want to know what patients remember." Late that night, while Heather was helping an elderly resident fold family photographs back into a worn album, Benjamin began reading hundreds of handwritten comments collected over several years. Most mentioned clean rooms, quick treatment, professional staff. Then one sentence caught his attention. "When my husband forgot everyone else's name, he still remembered the young CNA who always held his hand before bedtime." No employee name appeared, only initials. H.M. Benjamin reached into his pocket and gently wrapped his fingers around the navy button once more. He had started searching for the woman who gave away her coat. Now he was beginning to discover someone far more remarkable than he had imagined. The next week arrived wrapped in another stretch of bitter Ohio weather. But inside Whitmore Medical Center, the rhythm never slowed. Monitors beeped. Wheelchairs rolled across polished floors. Coffee cups disappeared almost as quickly as they were filled. Shift reports changed hands every morning and every evening, as though the building itself never truly slept. Heather Mitchell had recovered enough to return to her usual pace, though the lingering cough occasionally reminded her that her body had never been given enough time to rest. She ignored it. There were people depending on her. Just after 7 o'clock one evening, she entered room 418, carrying a small tray with warm oatmeal apple slices and a paper cup of tea. "Good evening, Mr. Franklin." The elderly man sitting beside the window slowly turned his head. For several seconds he looked frightened. His eyes searched the room with confusion. "Where's Margaret?" Heather recognized the question immediately. Every evening he asked for his wife. Every evening he forgot that Margaret Franklin had passed away nearly 9 years earlier. Some caregivers corrected him. Others changed the subject. Heather never did either. She gently placed the tray on the table before pulling a chair beside him. "You miss her tonight?" He nodded without looking away from the snowy window. "She always knew where I left my glasses." Heather smiled. "She sounds very patient." A faint chuckle escaped him. "The most patient woman who ever lived." They sat quietly for nearly a minute. Heather understood something that could never be written in a training manual. Sometimes lonely people didn't need answers. They simply needed company. Mr. Franklin finally looked toward her. "You remind me of her." Heather felt her throat tighten. "I'll take that as a wonderful compliment." He reached carefully for her hand. "Don't rush away yet." "I won't." Outside the room, 2 younger employees hurried past, carrying supplies. One glanced through the doorway. "She's behind schedule again." The other shrugged. "She's always talking." Neither realized that what looked like conversation was in many ways treatment. 10 minutes later, Heather left the room. Mr. Franklin finished every spoonful of his dinner. The previous evening he had barely touched it. Further down the hallway, Dr. Emily Carter reviewed patient charts outside the nurse's station. She had worked emergency medicine for over 20 years before transferring into geriatric care. Experience had taught her that healing rarely depended on medication alone. She noticed Heather sanitizing a wheelchair before returning it to storage. "You're staying late again." Heather smiled. "Just finishing a few things?" Emily folded her arms. "You know that isn't required." "I know." "Then why?" Heather looked toward the patient rooms. "My mom used to say people remember how you made them feel long after they forget your name." Emily smiled thoughtfully. "Your mother sounds like she was wise." "She was." "What did she do?" "She was a CNA." Emily nodded slowly. "That explains a lot." Before Heather could answer, a nurse hurried toward them. "Dr. Mr. Simmons is asking for you." Emily excused herself, but not before looking back once more. People often spoke about talent in medicine. Heather possessed something different. Presence. She had the rare ability to make anxious people believe they mattered. Across the building, Benjamin Whitmore walked quietly through another corridor wearing ordinary clothes beneath a visitor's badge. Only a handful of senior administrators knew he was there. Everyone else assumed he was simply visiting a relative. He preferred it that way. He stopped outside room 418, just as Mr. Franklin's daughter stepped into the hallway carrying her purse. She noticed Benjamin standing nearby. "I hope we're not blocking the hallway." "Not at all." She smiled warmly. "I was just looking for the young CNA who takes care of my father." Benjamin kept his expression neutral. "What makes her special?" The woman laughed softly. "You have a few minutes." "I do." "My father has Alzheimer's." Benjamin nodded. "I know how difficult that can be." "For months he stopped eating dinner." She glanced back into the room. "Everyone tried. Doctors, nurses, therapists. Nothing worked. And then Heather started sitting with him." Benjamin listened carefully. "She never argued when he forgot things. She never corrected him. She simply entered his world instead of forcing him into ours." The woman's eyes became moist. "Last Tuesday he smiled for the first time in weeks." Benjamin felt something stir deep inside him. "What happened?" He looked at Heather and said, "Thank you for remembering me." She wiped away a tear. The heartbreaking part. He wasn't thanking her for remembering his name. He was thanking her for remembering that he was still a person, Benjamin stood speechless. After the woman left, he remained in the hallway for several moments. Then he quietly removed the small notebook from his pocket. He wrote only one sentence. She reminds people they still matter. He underlined it twice. Later that evening, Daniel Brooks entered the administrative office carrying monthly performance summaries. He found Benjamin reviewing patient letters. "I wasn't expecting to see you tonight." Benjamin looked up pleasantly. "I've been reading." Daniel placed several reports on the desk. "Our staffing efficiency improved another 4%. Good. Sick leave decreased. Also good. Average task completion time is down." Benjamin nodded politely. Daniel waited. Normally, those numbers earned enthusiastic praise. Instead, Benjamin asked a different question. "How do you evaluate kindness?" Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry." "Kindness? We don't really have a metric for that." "What about trust?" Daniel hesitated. "That's difficult to quantify." Benjamin leaned forward. "So the qualities patients remember most aren't measured at all." Daniel searched for an answer, but couldn't find one. Before he left, Benjamin added quietly, "I think we've been counting the wrong things." After Daniel walked away, Benjamin returned to the growing stack of handwritten patient comments. Again and again, one employee appeared without anyone mentioning promotions, titles, or awards. They wrote about gentle conversations, warm blankets, birthday songs, holding frightened hands, waiting an extra minute before leaving a room. No committee had instructed Heather Mitchell to do those things. No policy required them. She simply believed they were part of caring for another human being. Benjamin reached into his coat pocket once more. His fingers found the familiar navy button. The woman who had given away her only winter coat wasn't extraordinary because of one act of generosity. She was extraordinary because she lived the same kindness every single day, even when no one important seemed to notice. Until now. On the first Monday of February, Heather Mitchell woke to the sound every parent fears. It wasn't a scream. It was silence. The kind of silence that follows when a child is struggling to breathe. She sat upright before she was fully awake. "Lily." From the next room came a faint wheezing sound. Heather rushed down the short hallway and found her daughter sitting upright in bed, shoulders rising and falling too quickly. Lily clutched her blanket with one hand while pressing the other against her chest. "I'm okay," she whispered between shallow breaths. Heather knew better. She reached immediately for the rescue inhaler on the nightstand. "Slow breath, sweetheart." Lily nodded, trying to follow her mother's calm voice even as panic filled her eyes. After 2 careful doses, they waited. The wheezing eased slightly. Not enough. Heather checked the clock. 3:17 a.m. Outside, another snowstorm had begun. She helped Lily into a heavy sweater, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and grabbed the small medical folder that contained insurance cards, prescriptions, and emergency contact information. The old Honda still sat at the repair shop. There was no choice except calling for a rideshare. Every minute waiting felt like 10. Heather kept speaking softly. "Look at me." Lily focused on her mother's face. "You're doing great. I know it's scary. But you're not alone." Those words were as much for Heather as they were for Lily. 40 minutes later, after a breathing treatment at a neighborhood urgent care clinic, the attack was under control. The physician adjusted Lily's medication and reminded Heather that winter air often triggered more frequent episodes. Heather thanked him sincerely. Then she looked at the bill her insurance wouldn't fully cover. Another unexpected expense. Another number she would somehow have to fit into a budget that already refused to stretch. By the time they returned home, dawn had broken. Heather looked at the clock again. 7:08 a.m. Her evening shift would begin in less than 12 hours. She should have slept. Instead, she spent the morning making soup for Lily, filling the new prescription, and calling the pharmacy to compare prices with a discount program she had recently discovered. She finally picked up her phone to call the hospital. Daniel Brooks answered. "This is Daniel." "Good morning, it's Heather Mitchell." A brief pause. "Go ahead." "My daughter had an asthma attack overnight." "I'm sorry to hear that. I've been at urgent care all morning. I'll need to come in a little late tonight." Silence. Then the clicking of a keyboard. "Heather, this will be your third attendance exception in 6 months," she frowned. "My last exception was when the city shut down roads during the blizzard." "It's still recorded as an attendance issue." "And the one before that?" "You left early after your vehicle broke down." Heather closed her eyes. "I made up those hours the next day." "I'm aware. I've never missed a shift without making the time back." Daniel's voice remained polite, but distant. "We have policies for consistency." "I understand." "We also have staffing requirements." "My daughter needed emergency treatment." "I sympathize." The words sounded rehearsed. But repeated attendance concerns affect scheduling decisions." Heather looked toward Lily, who had fallen asleep on the couch with a nebulizer resting beside her. "I'm asking for 1 hour." Daniel hesitated. "I'll note it." "What does that mean?" "It means future schedules may be adjusted if reliability becomes an issue." The conversation ended with professional courtesy. It also ended with Heather understanding exactly what had not been said. Her hours could be reduced. Reduced hours meant reduced income. Reduced income meant choosing which bills would remain unpaid. She placed the phone on the kitchen counter without speaking. Lily stirred awake. "Was that work?" Heather forced a smile. "Everything's okay." Children could hear worry even when adults hid it. Lily watched her mother carefully. "You made your worried face." Heather laughed softly, despite herself. "I have a worried face." "You bite the inside of your cheek." Heather hadn't even realized she was doing it. Later that afternoon, after asking a retired neighbor to stay with Lily until she returned from work, Heather caught the evening bus toward Whitmore Medical Center. She arrived exactly 58 minutes late, not 1 minute more. Inside the administrative hallway, Daniel happened to be reviewing staffing assignments. He glanced at the clock. "You made it." "I said I would." He checked something on his tablet. "I've documented today's delay." Heather nodded quietly. "I expected that." Before either of them noticed, another man stood farther down the corridor near a display honoring the hospital's founders. Benjamin Whitmore had arrived for another unannounced visit. He hadn't intended to overhear the conversation, but the nearly empty hallway carried every word. Daniel spoke without hostility. He believed he was simply enforcing policy. "Our department depends on reliability," Heather answered calmly. "So do patients." Daniel folded his arms. "This isn't personal." "I know." "If exceptions become routine," Heather interrupted gently, "my daughter couldn't breathe." The hallway fell silent. Daniel looked uncomfortable for only a moment before returning to his familiar language. "We have procedures." Heather nodded once. "And I have responsibilities." Without another word, she walked toward the employee lockers. Benjamin remained where he stood. He watched her disappear around the corner before looking at Daniel. The younger man hadn't noticed him. Benjamin wasn't angry. He was unsettled. Everything Daniel had said technically followed hospital policy. Nothing had been cruel, nothing had been insulting, yet something essential had still been missing. Context. Compassion. The ability to recognize that identical rules could produce very different outcomes depending on the human being standing in front of them. Benjamin quietly walked away without revealing himself. That evening he visited several patient rooms. Again and again he heard Heather's name, not because she had arrived late, Not because she worked overtime, because she made frightened people feel safe. Long after midnight, Benjamin sat alone in his office, holding the small navy button between his fingers. He thought about Heather standing in that hallway. She hadn't begged. She hadn't argued. She hadn't demanded special treatment. She had simply accepted another burden and kept walking toward the people who needed her. Benjamin looked out across the lights of Cleveland. For the first time since beginning his quiet investigation, he realized he had seen enough. The time for silent observation was nearing its end. 3 days after overhearing the conversation in the administrative hallway, Benjamin Whitmore requested something no one on the executive team expected. "I want a complete culture review." The conference room fell silent. Victoria Whitmore looked up from the quarterly financial report. "A culture review." Benjamin nodded. "Hospital-wide." Daniel Brooks adjusted his glasses. "We already conduct annual employee engagement surveys." "I'm not interested in surveys." Victoria frowned. "What exactly are you looking for?" Benjamin folded his hands. "I want to know how people experience this hospital." She exchanged a quick glance with the other executives. "We already measure patient satisfaction." "We measure scores," Benjamin replied calmly. "I want stories." No one spoke. Benjamin continued. "I want interviews with patients. Families. Volunteers. Environmental services. Transport staff. Housekeepers. Food service workers. Receptionists. And every nurse or CNA willing to speak honestly." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "This is going to take weeks, if necessary." "It will cost money." Benjamin smiled gently. "So does rebuilding trust after it's gone." Although she wasn't entirely convinced, Victoria approved the review. Over the next 2 weeks, a small independent consulting team quietly moved through Whitmore Medical Center. They wore simple visitor badges. Most employees assumed they were accreditation inspectors. Very few knew they had been personally selected by Benjamin. Unlike traditional evaluations, they weren't asking about budgets or productivity. Instead, they asked unusual questions. Who made you feel safe? Who remembered your name? When did you feel invisible? If one employee represents this hospital at its best, who would that be? The answers began arriving faster than anyone expected. A father whose premature son had spent 6 weeks in intensive care recalled a young CNA who found crayons so his older daughter wouldn't be frightened during visits. He couldn't remember her last name, only that it was Heather. An elderly woman recovering from hip surgery described waking up frightened in the middle of the night. "A nurse checked my medication," she explained, "but the CNA stayed until I fell asleep again." Her name, Heather. A volunteer remembered seeing Heather kneel beside a confused patient whose breakfast tray had spilled onto the floor. "There wasn't anything medically urgent," the volunteer said. "She simply didn't want him to feel embarrassed." Another family recalled arriving late after a snowstorm prevented them from saying goodbye before their grandmother passed away. They found a handwritten sympathy card waiting at the nurse's station. It wasn't hospital policy. It wasn't required. It was signed simply Heather. Meanwhile, Daniel reviewed staffing reports with growing satisfaction. Absenteeism remained low. Task completion continued improving. Budgets stayed on target. From his perspective, operations were running efficiently. He struggled to understand why Benjamin seemed increasingly interested in conversations rather than numbers. Late one afternoon, Benjamin invited Dr. Emily Carter into his office. She entered carrying a tablet and several patient charts. "You wanted to see me?" Benjamin gestured toward the chair across from him. "I've been reading interview transcripts." Emily smiled. "I imagine you've seen Heather's name a few times." Benjamin laughed softly. "A few hundred." Emily wasn't surprised. "That sounds about right." He studied her expression. You've worked with her for years. I have. What makes her different? Emily considered the question carefully. Most people think healthcare is about solving problems. Benjamin listened quietly. Heather understands that many problems can't be solved, she continued. Some patients won't recover. Some families will still lose someone they love. Some diagnoses can't be changed. Benjamin nodded slowly. So, what does she do? Emily smiled. She makes sure no one suffers alone. Those words lingered in the room. Benjamin looked down at the notebook lying open on his desk. He wrote them carefully. She makes sure no one suffers alone. He underlined the sentence. Has she ever asked for recognition? Emily actually laughed. Last year we tried to nominate her for an employee award. What happened? She declined. Benjamin looked genuinely surprised. Why? Emily remembered Heather's exact words. She said, if people start helping because they're chasing awards, we're measuring the wrong thing. Benjamin closed the notebook. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he asked another question. Has she ever complained? Emily thought back over 6 years. I've heard her complain about vending machine coffee. Benjamin smiled. But not about work. Oh, she's exhausted. She's worried about bills. She misses sleep. But she never makes patients carry the weight of those burdens. After Emily left, Benjamin remained seated for a long time. Outside his office window, snow drifted across the hospital courtyard. Employees hurried between buildings. Ambulances arrived. Life continued. He opened another folder prepared by the consulting team. This one summarized recurring themes. Most frequently praised employee qualities. Listens. Treats patients with dignity. Makes families feel included. Creates calm during stressful moments. Remembers personal details. Present in difficult conversations. Next to every category appeared the same handwritten note. Most frequently associated employee, Heather Mitchell. Benjamin leaned back quietly. The reports didn't describe extraordinary medical procedures. They described ordinary moments handled extraordinarily well. Holding a trembling hand, adjusting a blanket, remembering a grandchild's name, waiting 1 extra minute before leaving a room. Tiny actions, invisible on financial statements, unforgettable to the people receiving them. That evening, Benjamin walked through the hospital lobby. Near the entrance, he noticed a maintenance employee helping an elderly visitor zip her winter coat. Neither realized they were being observed. The woman smiled. The employee smiled back. Then both continued on with their day. Benjamin suddenly understood why Heather's kindness had spread so naturally. Compassion was contagious. One person demonstrated it, another repeated it, then another. A culture wasn't created by mission statements framed on walls. It was built through thousands of small choices made when no one important appeared to be watching. Benjamin reached into his coat pocket. The familiar navy button rested against his fingertips. For weeks it had reminded him of one selfless act at a freezing bus stop. Now it represented something much larger. Heather Mitchell had never intended to change an entire hospital. She had simply refused to stop seeing the humanity in people. Benjamin stood in the center of the lobby watching employees greet patients arriving through the sliding doors. The decision forming in his heart was no longer a possibility. It had become a responsibility. The hospital didn't need another expensive initiative. It needed people like Heather, teaching everyone else what compassionate care truly looked like. And Benjamin knew exactly where that change would have to begin. Benjamin Whitmore had spent decades believing that success could protect people from regret. He was wrong. Some regrets only grew heavier with time. On a quiet Saturday morning before the executive offices filled with meetings and presentations, Benjamin unlocked a small room tucked away behind the hospital library. Few employees even knew it existed. There were no computers inside, no awards, no photographs from ribbon-cutting ceremonies, only a wooden desk, 2 chairs, and an old cedar chest that had remained in the same corner for nearly 40 years. Benjamin knelt slowly and lifted the lid. Inside rested a handful of carefully preserved belongings: a faded floral scarf, a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, a paperback Bible with worn pages, and a black-and-white photograph of a smiling woman standing in front of a tiny farmhouse. He picked up the photograph with both hands. "Good morning, Mom," he whispered. Her name had been Eleanor Whitmore. Long before Benjamin became one of the wealthiest men in Ohio, Eleanor had worked as a school cafeteria cook in a small rural town. She had never earned much money, but everyone who met her remembered the same thing. She never allowed anyone to eat alone. If she noticed a child sitting quietly in the corner, she would carry her own lunch tray over without asking permission. If an elderly neighbor lost power during winter, Eleanor somehow always had an extra pot of soup ready. She used to tell Benjamin something he hadn't fully understood as a boy. The world remembers kindness long after it forgets comfort. Back then, he thought she was simply being poetic. Years later, those words became painfully real. When Benjamin was 34, Eleanor suffered a severe heart attack. The nearest hospital was overcrowded. Doctors were overwhelmed. Nurses hurried from one emergency to another. No one was intentionally cruel. No one ignored her because they lacked compassion. They simply didn't have enough time. Benjamin still remembered arriving breathless through the emergency entrance. His mother lay behind a curtain in a hallway because every room was occupied. Machines beeped around her. Stretchers lined both walls. Staff moved with exhausted determination. He had taken her hand. "I'm here." She smiled weakly. "I know." Those were the last words she ever spoke to him. For years afterward, Benjamin blamed himself. If only he had built something sooner. If only there had been another hospital. If only no family ever had to watch someone they loved become another patient, waiting in a crowded hallway. That promise became Whitmore Medical Center, not as a monument to success, as an apology he could never personally deliver. During its early years, Benjamin walked every hallway himself. He knew environmental service workers by name. He ate lunch beside nurses. He visited patients every afternoon. He even learned where volunteers stored extra blankets because he disliked seeing visitors shiver overnight. The hospital grew because people trusted it. Then success arrived. New campuses, research grants, expansion projects, board meetings, investment committees, national rankings. The larger the organization became, the farther Benjamin drifted from the ordinary conversations that had once shaped every decision. Without realizing it, he had begun managing reports instead of people. He knew operating margins, he knew occupancy rates, he knew construction budgets, but he no longer knew the names of the patients sitting alone after visiting hours. The realization haunted him. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Claire, his longtime assistant, stepped inside. "I'm sorry to disturb you." "It's all right." She noticed the photograph resting in his hands. "I haven't seen you come in here for a while." Benjamin smiled faintly. "Neither have I." Claire looked around the quiet room. "You built all of this because of her." "I thought I did." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Benjamin carefully returned the photograph to the cedar chest. "I built the buildings." He paused. "People like Heather are building the hospital." Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat across from him. "You've been thinking about her a great deal." "I've been thinking about what she represents." Benjamin reached into his pocket and removed the familiar navy button. Claire looked at it curiously. Most people would have thrown that away. Benjamin rolled the small button between his fingers. "It isn't the button. It's the choice attached to it." He placed it gently beside his mother's photograph. My mother would have done exactly what Heather did. Claire smiled. Then perhaps that's why you can't stop thinking about her. Benjamin nodded. I spent 40 years trying to create a place where kindness would be normal. He looked towards the window. Somehow the people writing policies forgot to include kindness in the measurements. Later that afternoon, Benjamin requested one more set of documents. Not financial statements, not expansion proposals, personnel histories from the hospital's earliest years. He spent hours reading records from employees who had retired decades earlier. Beside many names were handwritten notes from patients. She stayed after her shift. He never let my husband eat alone. They remembered my birthday. No one had instructed those employees to do such things. The culture had once rewarded compassion naturally because leaders had lived it themselves. Somewhere, over the years, that spirit had quietly faded beneath procedures, efficiency, and endless metrics. As evening approached, Benjamin walked through the hospital courtyard. Snow covered the benches where visitors often sat during warmer months. Near the entrance, he noticed a young nurse helping an elderly volunteer adjust her scarf before she stepped outside. Neither knew Benjamin was watching. He smiled. The spirit hadn't disappeared completely. It had simply become harder to notice, and perhaps harder to protect. He reached into his coat pocket again out of habit before remembering the button now rested beside his mother's photograph. For the first time in weeks, his pocket felt empty. Oddly, the emptiness brought him peace. The reminder no longer needed to stay with him every moment. Its lesson already had. Benjamin looked back at the hospital rising against the winter sky. When he founded Whitmore Medical Center, he had believed great hospitals were built with steel glass and remarkable physicians. Heather Mitchell had quietly reminded him that the strongest foundation had always been something much simpler. One ordinary person choosing compassion when no one was watching. And Benjamin knew that before he could change policies, departments, or leadership, he would first have to tell the entire hospital the story of a worn navy coat, a broken button, and the woman who had unknowingly brought its founder back to the promise he had made beside his mother's hospital bed. Nearly a month had passed since the freezing morning at the bus stop, yet Heather Mitchell rarely thought about the elderly stranger anymore. Life had a way of pushing extraordinary moments behind ordinary responsibilities. Lily's asthma was finally under control. The repair shop had managed to rebuild part of the Honda's electrical system using a refurbished alternator, lowering the bill enough that Heather could pay it in installments. The navy coat was gone, replaced by a second-hand gray jacket she had found at a neighborhood thrift store for $18. It wasn't as warm. It wasn't as comfortable. But it kept the wind away. That was enough. Late one Thursday afternoon, just before her shift began, Heather was surprised when a volunteer stopped beside the employee lockers. "Miss Mitchell," Heather looked up from tying her hair back. "Yes, the administration asked if you could come to conference room C after your shift." Heather frowned slightly. "Did they say why?" "I'm afraid not." Her first thought was that something had gone wrong. Perhaps another attendance review. Perhaps paperwork she had forgotten to complete. Perhaps budget cuts. She thanked the volunteer and spent the next 12 hours trying not to imagine the worst. By the time her shift ended, the hallway outside conference room C was nearly empty. Most administrators had already gone home. Heather knocked softly. A calm voice answered. "Please come in." She opened the door. The room was surprisingly simple. No long conference table, no group of executives. Only one elderly man sitting beside a window with 2 cups of coffee already waiting. For a second, Heather couldn't place him. Then she noticed his eyes, the bus stop, the snow, the trembling hands. "You," Benjamin smiled warmly. "I'm glad you remember." Heather stared in surprise. "You're all right." "I am." She smiled with visible relief before realizing how strange that sounded. I mean, I'm happy you're okay. I know what you meant. He stood slowly. I never properly thanked you. Heather shook her head. You don't have to. I think I do. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Would you sit with me for a few minutes? She hesitated only because she still wasn't sure why she had been called. Finally, she nodded. I can stay a little while. Benjamin slid one coffee toward her. I wasn't sure how you take it. Black is fine. So is mine. For a few moments, they simply sat quietly. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt oddly familiar. Almost like the conversation they had never finished at the bus stop. Benjamin looked toward the window overlooking the city. I've spent the last several weeks thinking about that morning. Heather laughed softly. I've mostly been thinking about whether I should have sewn that loose button back on. Benjamin smiled. It served an important purpose. She tilted her head curiously. I'm not sure how. You will. He carefully chose his next question. May I ask something? Of course. Why did you become a CNA? Heather didn't answer immediately. Instead, she wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. My mother. Benjamin nodded gently. Tell me about her. She worked in a nursing home. Heather's voice softened. We never had much money. But every Christmas, people kept knocking on our door. Former patients? She smiled. Their families. They'd bring homemade pies. Cards. Sometimes flowers. Benjamin listened without interrupting. When I asked why everyone loved her so much, she said something I'll never forget. Heather looked down at the steam rising from the coffee. Medicine helps people heal. She paused. But kindness helps people keep going until healing arrives. Benjamin felt a quiet ache in his chest. Those words sounded remarkably similar to something his own mother might have said. What happened to her? Cancer. I'm sorry. So am I. They sat silently again. After a while, Benjamin asked another question. Have you ever thought about doing something else? Heather smiled. Almost every payday. He laughed. Fair answer. But no. Why not? Because I still love walking into a room where someone feels frightened and watching their shoulders relax. Benjamin noticed she never mentioned salary. Prestige, promotion, only people. He leaned forward. If you could change one thing about this hospital. Heather looked genuinely uncomfortable. I probably shouldn't answer that. Why? I work here. And I don't want to sound ungrateful. Benjamin spoke gently. I'm asking because I truly want to know. Heather thought for nearly half a minute. Finally, she answered carefully. I wish we had more time. More time? She nodded. Everyone here works hard. Doctors, nurses, housekeeping, transport. No one is lazy. The problem is that we're all rushing. Benjamin remained silent. I sometimes leave a patient's room knowing I completed every required task. She searched for the right words, but still feeling like I failed them. Why? Because I didn't have 3 extra minutes to hear what they were trying to say. Benjamin's expression grew thoughtful. Heather continued. People think loneliness isn't a medical problem. I disagree. So do I, Benjamin replied quietly. She looked surprised. He asked one final question. If someone offered you more money tomorrow, she laughed, I wouldn't say no. So what would you do? Heather didn't hesitate this time. I'd work a little less. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. Not buy a bigger apartment. Eventually. Not replace your car. I should. Then why work less? Heather smiled. So I could eat breakfast with Lily before school. The answer lingered between them. Benjamin had expected many things. He had expected someone struggling financially to speak about debt, security, a better neighborhood. Instead, she had spoken about time. Time with her daughter. Time with patience. Time to treat people like human beings. He suddenly understood why every interview, every patient comment, every handwritten letter described the same woman. Heather didn't measure a successful day by how much she accomplished. She measured it by whether the people around her felt seen. Benjamin looked at her with quiet admiration. He still hadn't told her who he really was. Not yet. Tonight wasn't about revealing his identity. It was about confirming something he had begun to suspect weeks earlier. The woman sitting across from him had unknowingly reminded him why Whitmore Medical Center had been built in the first place, and before asking her to help change the future of the hospital, he wanted to be absolutely certain that the compassion she showed on a snowy bus stop lived just as deeply in every ordinary day of her life. Now, without a trace of doubt, he knew it did. The following Tuesday, an email marked Mandatory Executive Board Session appeared in the inbox of every senior administrator at Whitmore Medical Center. No agenda, no attachments, only one sentence: attendance required. Chairman Benjamin Whitmore will address the board personally. The message immediately sparked curiosity. Benjamin rarely attended full executive meetings anymore. Over the past 5 years, he had gradually stepped away from day-to-day leadership, leaving most strategic decisions to Victoria Whitmore and the executive team. No one knew why he had suddenly called everyone together. At exactly 9 o'clock that morning, executives, department directors, and board members settled into the large conference room overlooking downtown Cleveland. Victoria organized several financial reports in front of her. Daniel Brooks reviewed staffing statistics one last time. Chief physicians discussed expansion proposals in quiet voices. Everyone expected another conversation about budgets. Benjamin entered without an escort. He wasn't wearing one of his tailored suits. Instead, he carried an old brown coat folded carefully over one arm. The room immediately fell silent. He smiled politely. "Good morning." "Good morning." Several voices answered together. Benjamin didn't sit. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the long conference table. Without saying a word, he reached into the pocket of the brown coat. He placed something small onto the polished wood. Click. A single navy button rolled gently across the table before stopping directly in front of Victoria. People exchanged puzzled looks. Benjamin let the silence linger. Finally, he spoke. "Does anyone know what this is?" Someone smiled politely. "A coat button." "Yes." He nodded. "It is. But it also happens to be the most important object I've carried in my pocket for the past month." The room grew even quieter. Victoria looked at her father. "Dad." Benjamin gently raised one hand. "Please. I'd like everyone to hear this before we discuss anything else." He looked around the room. 3 weeks ago, I left this hospital before sunrise. I was dressed as an ordinary elderly man. No security. No driver. No one knew who I was. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Benjamin continued. I sat at a bus stop 2 blocks from this building. The temperature was 9 degrees. I had intentionally worn an old coat that wasn't warm enough. Daniel frowned slightly. Benjamin met his eyes. I wanted to see whether people still noticed one another. No one interrupted. For nearly 30 minutes, dozens of people walked past. They weren't bad people. They were busy. They were tired. They assumed someone else would help. He paused. Then one person stopped. Benjamin looked directly at the button lying on the table. She had just completed a 12-hour night shift. She earned far less than almost everyone in this room. She had a daughter waiting at home. She owned one winter coat. Another pause. And she gave it to me. The conference room became completely still. Benjamin's voice remained calm. When I asked why, she answered with words I have not been able to forget. He repeated them slowly. Because being cold shouldn't decide who gets tomorrow. Several board members lowered their eyes. Benjamin picked up the button. As she walked away, this broke off her coat. He held it between his fingers. She laughed, said the coat had seen better days. Then she boarded a bus and disappeared. Victoria finally spoke. Who was she? Benjamin looked toward the end of the table. Our investigation identified her. He turned toward Daniel. She's one of our employees. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. One of ours, Benjamin nodded. Certified nursing assistant. Part-time. 6 years of service. Daniel instinctively opened his laptop. Benjamin stopped him gently. You don't need to search. I already know her file. He looked around the room again. Her name is Heather Mitchell. Daniel froze. Victoria slowly leaned back in her chair. Several department leaders quietly recognized the name. Benjamin continued. I asked for patient interviews. I read years of comments. I met with physicians. I observed staff. Again and again, the same name appeared. He looked toward Dr. Emily Carter. Emily nodded quietly. Benjamin continued. No one praised her because she generated revenue. No one praised her because she worked faster. They praised her because she remembered names. Because she listened. Because frightened people felt less alone after she entered a room. He turned towards Daniel. Tell me, how is compassion measured in our employee evaluations? Daniel swallowed. It currently isn't. How is dignity measured? It isn't. How is trust measured? Daniel looked down. It isn't. Benjamin wasn't angry. His voice never rose. If our system cannot recognize the qualities patients remember most, then our system is incomplete. Silence filled the room. Victoria broke it first. What are you asking us to do? Benjamin smiled softly. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. He walked toward the large window overlooking the hospital campus. When I founded Whitmore Medical Center, I believed excellent healthcare required brilliant physicians. I still believe that. I believed it required advanced technology. I still believe that. But somewhere along the way, we forgot something even more fundamental. He turned back toward everyone. People come here because they're scared. They don't remember every diagnosis. They don't remember every medication. They remember how we made them feel. Benjamin placed the navy button back onto the table. This tiny piece of plastic reminded me of something 40 years of success nearly made me forget. His voice became quieter. Buildings don't heal people. Machines don't comfort families. Policies don't hold frightened hands. People do. No one moved. No one checked a phone. No one looked away. Benjamin let the words settle before speaking once more. Today marks the beginning of a different kind of transformation. It won't start with another building. It won't begin with another fundraising campaign. It begins by changing what and who we choose to value. He looked directly at Victoria, then at Daniel, then around the entire room. And before this month ends, every person in this hospital will know the story of a woman who walked away shivering so a stranger could stay alive. He closed his hand around the button one final time. And they will also understand why that woman is about to help reshape the future of Whitmore Medical Center. The room remained silent long after Benjamin finished speaking. For the first time in years, the board wasn't thinking about budgets, occupancy rates, or quarterly growth. They were thinking about a worn navy coat and the employee they had walked past for 6 years without ever realizing she had become the quiet heart of the hospital. The morning after the board meeting, rumors spread through Whitmore Medical Center faster than any official announcement. Some employees whispered that the chairman planned to replace senior leadership. Others believed another expansion project had been approved. A few insisted the hospital was preparing for a merger. Only the people who had been inside the boardroom knew the truth. The biggest change would not involve buildings. It would involve people. At 10 o'clock, Benjamin Whitmore stood beside Victoria in the hospital auditorium. More than 200 department supervisors, physicians, nurses, therapists, environmental service workers, receptionists, and support staff filled the seats. Heather Mitchell sat near the back beside Dr. Emily Carter, convinced she had only been invited because every department had been asked to send representatives. She had no idea what was coming. Benjamin stepped to the podium. For a moment, he simply looked across the audience. Faces of every age, every background, every position. This was the community he had dreamed of building decades earlier. "Thank you for being here." His voice carried easily through the room. "For 40 years, this hospital has measured many important things." He paused. "We have measured recovery rates, safety, innovation, research, efficiency. Those things matter. They always will." He smiled gently. "But over the past month, I discovered something we have failed to measure." He looked toward the back rows. "We have failed to recognize the people who quietly protect the dignity of others." Several employees exchanged curious glances. Benjamin continued. "Beginning today, Whitmore Medical Center will launch a new initiative called the Compassion Mentor Program." A large screen behind him displayed the title in simple blue letters. No flashy graphics, no marketing slogan. Just the words, Compassion Mentor Program. Victoria stepped forward. "This program is not about creating another layer of management. It is not another performance evaluation. It is an investment in the human side of healthcare." She spoke more softly than usual. "Every new employee, from physicians to housekeeping staff, will spend time learning from people whose daily actions consistently build trust with patients." Heather listened politely. She assumed the mentors would be experienced nurses or department directors. Benjamin returned to the microphone. "The first mentor has already been chosen." Heather barely paid attention. She glanced down at the folded schedule in her hands. Then she heard her own name. Heather Mitchell. For several seconds, she genuinely believed she had misheard. People around her turned toward the back row. Emily smiled before gently squeezing Heather's arm. "It's you." Heather looked completely stunned. "No." Benjamin continued speaking. "Heather, would you please join us?" The auditorium erupted into warm applause. Heather remained frozen. Emily whispered, "Go." Slowly, almost uncertainly, Heather stood. She walked toward the stage, feeling every pair of eyes following her. She wasn't embarrassed. She was confused. When she reached the podium, Benjamin greeted her with the same warm smile she remembered from the conference room. "Thank you for coming." I'm not sure why I'm here." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the audience. Benjamin looked at everyone before answering. "Because you remind us who we're supposed to be." Heather lowered her eyes. "I don't think I've done anything special." Benjamin smiled. "That's exactly why you're here." He turned towards the audience. "Over the past several weeks, I interviewed patients. I read thousands of comments. I observed employees. Again and again, I found one remarkable pattern. People rarely remembered procedures. They remembered people." He looked toward Heather. They remembered the woman who stayed an extra minute. They remembered the person who listened. They remembered feeling seen. Benjamin reached into his pocket. Heather immediately recognized the navy button resting in his hand. Her eyes widened. You kept it. I did. I thought you'd thrown it away. Benjamin shook his head. I've carried it every day. He held it carefully between 2 fingers so everyone could see. This button represents a choice. A choice to care. A choice made when nobody was watching. The room became completely silent. Benjamin looked back at Heather. I am not asking you to teach medical procedures. We already have experts for that. I'm asking you to teach something much harder. Heather whispered almost to herself. I don't know how. Benjamin answered gently. You already have. Victoria stepped beside them. For perhaps the first time in years, her voice carried none of its usual executive confidence, only sincerity. Heather, I owe you an apology. Heather looked surprised. Victoria continued. I've spent years believing that leadership meant improving numbers. I forgot those numbers belong to people. She looked around the auditorium. My father reminded me of that. Your example made me believe it. The audience remained completely quiet. Daniel Brooks slowly stood from his seat. I'd like to say something. Benjamin nodded. Daniel faced Heather. I've evaluated your attendance. I've reviewed your paperwork. I've discussed scheduling with you. He hesitated. I never once asked what kind of difference you made after entering a patient's room. Heather didn't know what to say. Daniel took a slow breath. I'm sorry. The apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. It was honest. Heather smiled gently. Thank you. No anger, no bitterness, just gratitude. Benjamin noticed that response immediately. Even after weeks of stress, she still chose grace. He had expected nothing less. Later that afternoon, after the auditorium emptied, Heather and Benjamin remained near the stage. She looked at the large screen displaying the words Compassion Mentor Program. I still don't think I'm the right person. Benjamin chuckled softly. May I tell you a secret? She nodded. When I built this hospital, I was certain leadership belonged to the loudest people in the room. He smiled warmly. You've taught me that sometimes it belongs to the quietest. Heather looked down at the button still resting in his hand. I only gave away a coat. Benjamin shook his head. No. You gave away certainty. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? You made me question everything I thought I knew about this hospital. He carefully placed the navy button into her palm. It belongs with you now. Heather closed her fingers around it. The small piece of plastic felt unexpectedly heavy. Not because of what it was, because of everything it now represented. For the first time since that freezing morning at the bus stop, she finally understood that one simple act of kindness had never been about an old man needing warmth. It had become the beginning of something much larger, something capable of changing not only her own future, but the future of everyone who would one day walk through the doors of Whitmore Medical Center, searching for hope. Heather Mitchell barely slept that night. The navy button rested on the kitchen table beside Lily's box of crayons, catching the soft glow of the overhead light. Every time Heather walked past it, she still struggled to believe everything that had happened during the past 24 hours. She had gone to work expecting another ordinary shift. Instead, she had become the face of a program that would influence the future culture of the largest hospital in the city. Lily stared at the button while eating cereal before school. So this is the button from your coat, Heather smiled. It is. The one that fell off. Yes. Lily picked it up carefully with both hands as though it were something fragile. It doesn't look very important. Heather looked at her daughter. I used to think that too. Lily turned the button over thoughtfully. I guess important things don't always look important. Heather laughed softly. I think you just figured out something many adults never do. After walking Lily to the school bus, Heather drove her repaired Honda toward Whitmore Medical Center. The old car still rattled whenever it reached 40 miles an hour. The heater worked only on the highest setting. A strip of duct tape still covered a crack near the dashboard. None of that bothered her. For the first time in years, she arrived at work feeling something unfamiliar. Hope. Not because life had suddenly become easy. Her bills were still waiting. The apartment was still small. The car was still old. Hope came from knowing that someone had finally decided kindness deserved a place at the decision-making table. When she entered the hospital lobby, several employees smiled as she walked past. Some offered congratulations. Others simply thanked her. Heather felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I haven't done anything," she kept insisting. Dr. Emily Carter caught up with her near the elevators. "You've said that 6 times already this morning." Heather sighed. "Because it's true." Emily smiled knowingly. "No. You've simply done what came naturally. There's a difference." Before Heather could answer, a young nurse hurried toward them. She looked nervous. "Miss Mitchell?" Heather turned. "Yes. I started here 3 weeks ago." Heather recognized her from one of the medical floors. "My name is Ava. It's nice to meet you properly." Ava hesitated before continuing. "I wanted to thank you." Heather looked confused. "For what?" "I saw you last week. You were sitting beside Mr. Franklin during your break." Heather remembered. "He was having a difficult afternoon." Ava nodded. "I almost walked past. I had medication to deliver. I was running behind." She looked down briefly. "But then I remembered how calmly you were talking to him. So I went back after my rounds. And I stayed 10 minutes. Her smile grew. "He finally agreed to eat." Heather felt unexpectedly emotional. "You did that?" Ava shook her head. "No. I only noticed because you did it first." After the young nurse walked away, Emily quietly smiled. "See?" Heather looked puzzled. "What?" "The program already started." "But we haven't held the first class." Emily gently laughed. "Leadership rarely begins in classrooms. It begins where people decide who they want to become." Later that afternoon, Heather attended the first planning meeting for the Compassion Mentor Program. Around the conference table sat physicians, nurses, therapists, environmental services, supervisors, volunteer coordinators, and administrators. To Heather's surprise, Daniel Brooks entered carrying a notebook instead of his usual tablet. He chose a seat beside her. "I hope that's all right." "Of course." For a few awkward moments, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "I've been reviewing our employee evaluations." Heather looked toward him. "There isn't a single section asking whether patients feel respected." "No? There isn't one asking whether families feel heard." She nodded quietly. "I know." Daniel sighed. "I honestly believed I was being fair." "You were following the system." "I was." "But the system wasn't asking the right questions." Heather smiled gently. "It's never too late to ask better ones." Daniel looked relieved. "Thank you." He expected criticism. Instead, he received understanding. Benjamin had been right. Heather didn't simply forgive people. She invited them to grow. Across the room, Victoria Whitmore observed the exchange carefully. Only weeks earlier, she would have measured success by attendance percentages and quarterly reports. Now she found herself writing something entirely different inside her notebook. Create space for employees to know patients. Protect time for conversations. Reward acts of compassion. She smiled to herself. Her father had been right. Changing a culture began with changing what leaders noticed. Over the following month, Heather spent several hours each week meeting newly hired employees. She never lectured. She never spoke about herself. Instead, she asked simple questions. Who was the kindest person you ever met? What did they do? When was the last time someone made you feel truly seen? Those conversations transformed the room. One housekeeping employee described a fourth-grade teacher who always remembered birthdays. A respiratory therapist recalled a stranger who stayed with him after a car accident until his family arrived. A security officer admitted that his grandfather had died alone years earlier, and ever since then he always stopped to speak with elderly visitors walking through the lobby. Heather listened more than she talked. By the end of every session, people realized something remarkable. Compassion wasn't another task added to their workload. It was the way they carried out every task they already had. Several weeks later, Benjamin quietly stood outside one of Heather's mentor sessions without entering. Through the partially open door, he watched a room full of employees laughing together. There were doctors sitting beside janitors, receptionists talking with surgeons, environmental services staff sharing stories with pharmacists. Titles had disappeared. Only people remained. Benjamin felt the same quiet satisfaction he had experienced 40 years earlier, on the day the hospital first opened its doors. Not because another building had been completed, but because its original purpose had finally begun to breathe again. As he walked away, he passed the community relations office, where volunteers were discussing a new winter outreach project. One of them suggested collecting donated coats for families waiting outside emergency departments. Benjamin smiled. No executive had proposed the idea. No committee had assigned it. Kindness was already beginning to spread on its own, and he knew the circle was only getting larger. Almost a year passed before the city saw another winter as unforgiving as the one that had changed Heather Mitchell's life. By early January, Cleveland was once again wrapped in deep snow. Weather reports warned residents to avoid unnecessary travel, and local shelters filled before sunset. The sidewalks around Whitmore Medical Center disappeared beneath layers of fresh snow, while the familiar bus stop across the street looked almost exactly as it had on that unforgettable morning. Heather noticed it the moment she finished her afternoon mentoring session. She stopped beneath the hospital's glass entrance for a second, watching thick snowflakes drift through the glow of the parking lot lights. For an instant, she remembered standing there in her old navy coat. She remembered the wind. She remembered the elderly stranger whose name she hadn't known. Then she smiled. Now she knew his name better than almost anyone. "Miss Mitchell." A volunteer hurried toward her. "We've finished organizing tomorrow's orientation." "Wonderful. And the coat wall is almost full?" Heather looked toward the lobby. "I'll stop by before I leave." Near the main entrance stood one of the newest additions to Whitmore Medical Center. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't complicated. It was simply a long wooden wall lined with sturdy hooks. Above it hung a hand-painted sign. "Community Coat Wall. Take one if you need one. Leave one if you can. No questions asked." The idea had started during one of the earliest Compassion Mentor meetings. No one could remember exactly who first suggested it. Within weeks, employees had begun bringing winter coats from home. Patients' families joined them. Local churches donated children's jackets. Schools organized collection drives. Even nearby businesses quietly dropped off boxes filled with scarves, gloves, hats, and blankets. The wall was never locked. No paperwork, no registration, no proof of income. People simply took what they needed. Heather often paused there before going home. Sometimes she straightened crooked hangers. Sometimes she matched lost gloves. Sometimes she quietly replaced handwritten size labels that had fallen off. Small things. She still believed small things mattered. That evening, as she prepared to leave, movement outside the hospital caught her attention. Across the street at the same bus stop where everything had begun, a young woman stood holding a toddler beneath a thin fleece blanket. The child couldn't have been older than 3. Snow covered the mother's hair. She kept rubbing the little girl's back, trying desperately to warm her. Heather didn't hesitate. She grabbed 2 coats from the community coat wall, one adult, one child, then crossed the street. "Excuse me." The young mother turned quickly, embarrassment immediately filling her face. I'm sorry. We're not asking anyone for money. Heather smiled gently. I know. She held out the smaller coat first. I thought she might like this. The little girl stared at the bright red winter coat with wide eyes. Her mother looked overwhelmed. We can't pay for it. You don't have to. But Heather pointed toward the hospital entrance. See that wooden wall? The woman nodded uncertainly. There are hundreds more. They're there for anyone who needs them. The little girl carefully slipped into the coat. It fit almost perfectly. She buried her face against the warm collar and smiled. Her mother suddenly began crying. Not loudly, just quietly. The kind of tears that appear after someone has spent too long pretending to be strong. I'm Melissa, she whispered. Heather. Melissa wiped her eyes. I lost my apartment 2 weeks ago. I'm staying with my sister. But tonight, she looked away. She said there wasn't enough room. Heather didn't interrupt. Melissa continued. I kept telling my daughter we were just waiting for the bus. She looked down at the child. But I didn't know where we were going. Heather understood. Not every emergency arrived in an ambulance. Some arrived carrying backpacks and diaper bags. She knelt beside the little girl. What's your name? Sophie. Do you like hot chocolate? Sophie nodded enthusiastically. Heather smiled. I know somewhere that makes wonderful hot chocolate. She looked back at Melissa. Come inside. I'm not a patient. You don't have to be. I don't want to cause trouble. You won't. A few minutes later, they walked into the hospital lobby together. Several employees looked up. Not one questioned why Heather had brought strangers inside. Instead, the receptionist smiled warmly. I'll put water on. A volunteer found coloring books for Sophie. Someone from food services prepared 2 cups of soup without being asked. Another employee quietly called a local family shelter that partnered with the hospital. Everything happened naturally. No one waited for permission. Benjamin Whitmore watched from the second-floor balcony. He had just finished a donor meeting when he noticed Heather crossing the street. He remained still observing quietly. She never looked toward him. She wasn't performing kindness. She simply saw people the way she always had. Victoria joined him a few moments later. She followed his gaze toward the lobby below. Is that the coat wall? Benjamin nodded. It is. Victoria smiled as she watched employees gathering around Melissa and Sophie. It feels different in here now. Benjamin looked around the busy lobby. Patients checking in, volunteers greeting visitors, doctors stopping to say hello to environmental services staff, children laughing near the coat wall. It is different. Victoria looked at her father. You were right. Benjamin shook his head gently. No. Heather was. Downstairs, Sophie finished her hot chocolate and looked up at Heather. When I get bigger, Heather smiled. Yes. I'm going to bring coats, too. Heather felt tears gathering in her eyes. You know what? What? I think that's the best promise I've heard all year. As the snow continued falling outside, another winter evening settled over Cleveland. 1 year earlier, a single worn Navy coat had warmed one stranger. Now hundreds of coats lined the hospital wall, warming people Heather would never even meet. The kindness had traveled farther than she had ever imagined, not because someone wealthy paid for everything, but because one act of compassion had quietly inspired hundreds of ordinary people to believe that warmth like hope was always meant to be shared. 1 year after a worn Navy coat changed the direction of countless lives, Whitmore Medical Center gathered in its central atrium for an event unlike any it had ever hosted. There were no banners celebrating financial milestones, no announcements about new buildings, no speeches about record-breaking revenue. Instead, the stage was decorated with photographs taken throughout the year. a volunteer helping an elderly visitor button her coat, a surgeon sitting beside a frightened child before surgery, environmental services employees laughing with recovering patients, the community coat wall overflowing with winter jackets in every color imaginable. Each photograph captured the same quiet truth. Compassion had become visible. Nearly every employee who could step away from work for an hour filled the atrium. Patients who had recovered returned with their families. Former employees came back just to witness the celebration. Among them sat Melissa and little Sophie, now wearing the same bright red coat Heather had given her months earlier. Melissa had found steady work through a community employment program connected to the hospital, and Sophie proudly carried a small paper bag. Inside the bag was a neatly folded children's winter coat. Benjamin Whitmore waited backstage. Claire adjusted his tie before smiling. "You seem nervous." Benjamin laughed softly. "I've spoken to thousands of people, but this one feels different," Claire nodded. "Because this one matters." Benjamin reached into a small wooden box resting on the table. Inside lay the familiar navy button. Beside it rested another object, the old navy coat. Months earlier, after hearing the entire story, Lily had secretly asked Heather if they could repair it instead of leaving it forgotten in a closet. Together they had carefully sewn every loose seam. They patched the worn elbows. They reinforced the lining. And they replaced every missing button. Every button except one. The original broken button had never been sewn back. Instead, Lily had stitched a small piece of blue thread through the empty buttonhole. "Sometimes," she had said, "it's nice to remember that something was broken before it helped people." Benjamin had never forgotten those words. As his name was announced, the audience rose in warm applause. He walked slowly onto the stage carrying the repaired navy coat over one arm. The applause faded into complete silence. Benjamin looked across the crowd before speaking. "A year ago, I believed I was the founder of this hospital." He smiled gently. "I've since realized I was mistaken." Confused smiles spread across the audience. "I built these buildings. I helped raise money. I signed documents. But hospitals are not built by architects. They are built by people." He lifted the navy coat for everyone to see. "Many of you know this coat." A few quiet laughs drifted through the audience. "It belonged to a woman who believed someone else's tomorrow mattered more than her own comfort." Benjamin looked toward the front row. Heather sat beside Lily, both visibly emotional. "I asked her why she gave this coat to a stranger." His voice softened. She answered, "Because being cold shouldn't decide who gets tomorrow." The audience remained perfectly still. Benjamin continued, "I carried the missing button from this coat in my pocket for weeks. I thought it was reminding me of one extraordinary act." He shook his head. "It wasn't. It was reminding me of thousands of ordinary choices. The choice to listen. The choice to slow down. The choice to remember someone's name. The choice to see a frightened patient before seeing another task." He turned toward Heather. "Mrs. Mitchell." Heather looked up. "Would you and Lily please join me?" The audience erupted into applause once again. Heather gently squeezed Lily's hand. Together they walked onto the stage. Lily stared wide-eyed at the crowd. Benjamin knelt slightly so he was at her eye level. "I've been wanting to thank you." Lily blinked. "Me?" "Yes. You repaired this coat." She nodded proudly. "We wanted it to keep helping people." Benjamin smiled. "And it has." He stood again before addressing the audience. "This coat will not hang in a museum. It will not be locked behind glass." Instead, he walked toward the community coat wall that had been temporarily extended into the atrium for the celebration. Hundreds of coats hung neatly from polished wooden hooks. Benjamin gently placed the navy coat among them. A ripple of emotion spread through the crowd. The greatest honor we can give this coat is allowing it to warm someone else. Tears filled Heather's eyes. She had expected recognition. She had never expected the story to end this way. Benjamin stepped back from the wall. There is one more tradition I'd like to begin. He looked toward the children gathered near the front. Every year, the first coat placed on this wall will come from someone who once received kindness. Melissa quietly nudged Sophie. The little girl stood clutching the paper bag. She walked slowly toward the stage. Without saying a word, she removed the small children's coat from the bag and carefully hung it beside Heather's navy coat. Then she turned toward Benjamin. "My mommy says somebody helped us." Benjamin smiled. "Someone did." Sophie looked at Heather. "When another little girl gets cold, this can be hers." Heather could no longer hold back her tears. She embraced Sophie before looking toward Lily. Lily smiled through tears of her own. "Warm things are meant to be shared." Benjamin repeated the sentence into the microphone. "Warm things are meant to be shared." This time the audience answered together. "Warm things are meant to be shared." The words echoed through the atrium, not as a slogan, but as a promise. A promise that no patient would be treated like a number. A promise that no employee's kindness would go unnoticed. A promise that compassion would never again be considered invisible work. As the ceremony came to an end, people didn't rush toward the exits. Instead, they gathered around the community coat wall. Some hung up coats they had brought from home. Others quietly selected one for a family member. Volunteers greeted newcomers. Doctors carried donation boxes. Housekeepers helped children reach the lower hooks. There was no distinction between titles anymore, only neighbors helping neighbors. Standing near the entrance, Heather watched the scene unfold. 1 year earlier, she had believed she was simply giving away an old coat. Now she understood the truth. Kindness was never really about the thing being given. It was about the invitation it offered. An invitation for someone else to believe that goodness was still possible, and to pass it forward. As fresh snow began falling outside the hospital, once more the navy coat swayed gently among hundreds of others. It no longer belonged to Heather. It belonged to everyone who needed warmth, and perhaps, even more importantly, to everyone who still believed that a single act of compassion could change far more than one life. Sometimes we believe the greatest changes come from extraordinary people with extraordinary resources. But the truth is often much quieter. A kind word spoken at the right moment, a few extra minutes spent listening, or even an old winter coat offered to someone in need, can begin a chain of events that reaches farther than we could ever imagine. Heather never expected recognition. She never asked for a reward. She simply chose compassion over convenience. That single decision reminded a hospital founder of the promise he had made decades earlier, and inspired an entire community to see people before problems, dignity before efficiency, and humanity before titles. Kindness is powerful because it cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. Its true value appears in the hearts it comforts, the hope it restores, and the people it inspires to do the same for someone else. Every act of compassion plants a seed. And although we may never witness all the lives it touches, those seeds continue to grow long after the moment has passed. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your life? Or have you been able to pass one forward to someone else? Share your story. It may inspire another person today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about hope, courage, and the quiet heroes who remind us of the best in humanity, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. Thank you for spending your time with us, and until our next story, remember, warm things are always meant to be shared.